I'd like to give an account of my encounter with an entity which seems to be sharing some of the Skinwalker traits. I believe it is a Skinwalker's European counterpart of sorts, so I presume you might be interested in hearing my story. It happened in Central Europe, in late August or early September of 2011. The exact date escapes me. On a day that marks a very tragic event in my country's recent history. Coincidence number 1. I returned to work from a week-long vacation, only to discover there was a new girl in the office. She really turned my head, and the attraction seemed to be mutual. We started to socialize, and to my utter amusement, I uncovered that we shared a plethora of interests: astronomy, philosophy, psychology, hiking, science fiction, music, video games, and what have you. So on top of all the proverbial chemistry and enchantment, we clicked with each other from A to Z. She was a fresh university graduate, still living with her parents in a small town some 20 miles up north. Oftentimes, I gave her a ride from work, and more often than not, we hung out afterwards. Her hometown was rather small and uneventful, but the landscape around it was picturesque. Therefore, instead of spending our evenings in coffee shops and tea houses, we would simply drive to those woody hills surrounding the town. There, sitting on a hilltop, we would eat pizza and sip juice, stargaze, and discuss Jupiter and its satellites. Usually we went to the hills on the northeast side of town, but for the first time, we chose to go to the southeast hills. So I started our descent from that hill on a very dusty and bumpy unpaved road. I drove a rare sportsback, which I took good care of, and since I didn't want to screw up its underbelly or the brake axles, I was tootling pretty slow, crawling and zigzagging so to as avoid all those pits and bumps. The area was well lit by the moon. I can't recall whether or not it was a full moon, but I am certain it was in gibbous phase at the very least. I could see the surrounding trees just fine, and the clearings were illuminated nicely. Then through the windshield, I saw something at the far end of a larger clearing on the right side, just a few meters away from the tree line. First I thought it was some person riding a donkey, but come a second glance, and I assumed it was the other way around. The donkey was actually riding the guy. Now that whole idea is grotesque on its own, but the fact they both seemed to be somewhat crooked and twisted further intensified the bizarre and horrific absurdity of the situation. I couldn't simply figure out what was actually transpiring over there. As we approached them from behind, and almost leveled with them, I spotted what I thought were a pair of trousers, loose and halfway down that person's hips. And then, almost simultaneously, with noticing the trousers, I realized there was no donkey. There was no second protagonist of whatever was happening there. All this time I had been looking at one entity, one creature. I remember my feelings, complete bewilderment and awe, but no fear. Although I was not scared, I could almost hear my soul screaming from deep down inside. Whatever was happening, I sensed it as an act against nature, against humanity, against the universe, against God. Unnatural, inhuman, and most of all, ungodly. The sense of unholy wickedness and vileness emanating from the creature was so overwhelming that it actually made me look away. The few more glances I gave were all very short and strained. It was big, probably about 7 to 8 feet tall. Its legs were bowed or crooked weirdly, and there were those saggy trousers hanging around the hips. It was leaning forward, its posture resembling the leaning tower head start type, with a pair of very long arms, unnaturally hovering above the ground. It did not move, but its posture and pose was so unnatural that I surmised we come upon it, right in the middle of its transformation. Then it turned its head our way. Its face was all shiny in the moonlight, almost silverly white or something, so I couldn't really see the features in Ultra HD, yet I remember the following: the moose-like antlers, which were crooked, the elongated moose-like face with human-like eyes and a vile grin. The latter was more felt than seen, though I am not at all certain about it. The creature looked at us undeterred, seemingly grinning, and then I heard a thought in my head. Something along the lines of, "You're screwed, boy," or "Now you're trapped." I could not decipher if it was my own making or it was the creature talking to me, but then I really didn't consider the latter. I just heard it and felt it at the same time I grasped the creature's immense malicious joy. To me it was gloating. Despite the overwhelming sense of wickedness and unrightfulness of the whole thing, I never felt any fear or dread, so I was not compelled to speed up as we passed it, entering a long alley with trees almost completely covering the sky arc above us. What the hell was that? We asked each other in almost unison. We compared our observations, and I realized that she was very unnerved, unlike myself, and kept frowning. I was quite eager to discuss the creature, but she resolutely declared she wanted to neither talk nor think about it anymore. I didn't want to risk upsetting her. Besides, as fascinating as the whole encounter was, I was far more excited about unfolding completely different kinds of mysteries which awaited me ahead, so I complied. The ensuing relationship lasted for almost 4 years and left me on the brink of emotional, mental, and physical wreckage. Yes, it all started like a great big never-ending love story, but those of you who have been in a relationship will definitely understand. It took me almost 2 full years to recover, and looking back, I wonder, was it all just a simple coincidence? Or was this thing, this wicked creature, a harbinger, an omen, a sign of what was yet to come? Was it there in the middle of nowhere, on our path on a very special day, by concatenation of circumstances? Should I have listened and acted upon that ominous, threatening voice in my head, which forebode my mind-boggling suffering? I wish I knew. What I know for certain is that if there is a next time, and I encounter something similar again, I'm going to be more thoughtful about the life choices and paths I will be taking at a time, and won't ignore any red flags. Once bitten, twice shy. Yesterday, I had a very weird encounter. I live in Austria and was collecting mushrooms in a forest in an area full of mountains. I was often in this forest, so I knew the area pretty well. But this time, I went deeper into the woods because there was a trail of mushrooms leading into the forest. Around 200 meters deep in the woods, I couldn't find any mushrooms anymore, but I still searched the area for more. After 20 minutes, I heard a wild boar. This wasn't very unusual because there are quite a lot of them in the forest in Austria. But then, I saw it, and I was very scared because the eyes and the body were just wrong. I couldn't see what was wrong about these body parts, but they were just strange and not like the ones of other wild boars I've seen before. I was scared and decided to go slowly out of the forest without turning away from the animal. Whenever I stepped a foot backwards, the thing stepped on forwards. Finally, I was able to get near my car, so I sprinted towards it. When I got inside my car, I started to drive away. I looked back in the rearview mirror and saw a twisted boar, which was standing on 2 feet, running back into the forest. I'm not 100% sure if what I saw was a skinwalker, because this took place in Austria. However, what do you guys think it was? Navajo Skinwalker story. Please be advised, if you are traditional, you may not want to read this story. This is my Skinwalker story. I'm half Navajo and half Mexican. For over 20 years of my life, I lived on the Navajo Nation Reservation in New Mexico. My Native American side of my family always warned us to be careful at night. My grandparents would always tell me stories of these shape-shifting witches who can curse you, kill you, or mess with you. They called them skinwalkers. They called them skinwalkers because they would take the skin of dead animals and wear them to change into that animal, or something between human and animal. I never believed it really. I'm only half Navajo and light-skinned, so I was never treated the same by most people here, so I drifted away from the culture and thought it wasn't for me. So this happened to me when I was in high school, so about 6 to possibly 8 years ago. I would have been like 15 or 17 then. I used to hang out with a group of guys who liked to do a lot of delinquent type stuff. You know, smoke cigs, stay up all night, and the guys playing video games at somebody's house. Then at 3 a.m., if we felt like it, we would go out to sneak to paradise. I know it's an ironic name. It's basically a giant metal pipe that carries irrigation water to all the farms. But it really was also a spot for kids to drink or get high in the evenings. However, the place did have a scary history of kids and adults who drowned or died in the night, but I always thought those were urban legends also. But at 3 a.m., that was our time we as boys would test one another to cross the pipe. Sort of an initiation of sorts. See how far you could go. We usually could go all the way across. Now keep in mind that the pipe goes well over 3 stories high. It's also wide. I'd say as wide as an average car. We would walk this thing for kicks in a group of 9 at 3 a.m. So one night, me and a small group of friends were driving around bored at 2 a.m., wanting to spook each other. So I said, let's go to Paradise and walk the pipe. Most of these friends that I was hanging out with had never been there. They agreed, pumped on energy drinks, and we drove. It was pretty quiet. The sky was dark, the night was cold. The boys with me were Michael, Cordy, Tommy, and Thurl. Now Thurl was the driver because he had the car and his family was pretty well off, so he never had to worry about cash. We got to the place and he didn't want to go. Said his parents were traditional and he wanted to just chill in his car. Basically, he wanted to text some chick, I'm sure, without us bugging him. I told him it's fine, and to keep the car locked and running in case we see something scary. Me and the other boys went on without him. As we got onto the pipe, a few of the guys were scared and had me take lead. As we'd crawl, I'd say about a fourth of the way on the pipe, we were talking and laughing. I noticed a faint white or gray bat bigger than my head flying around us. It dived for us a few times. We dodged it, but then Tommy slipped because of his Converse he was wearing, and almost fell off the pipe. I reached out to grab his right arm. Michael had grabbed my shirt collar, and Cordy had grabbed him too. Altogether, we got back on the pipe shaken. That we almost lost Tommy into the dark depths below. The bat was gone. We were all freaking out, but the guys wanted to continue. We laughed about it, as guys usually do. We passed the halfway point on the pipe with no problem. But as we got 3/4 of the way, Michael saw something. You see, at the end of the pipe, there is a hill. Behind that hill, it is very brightly lit, because of a church somewhere off in the distance. Anyway, on that hill, there was a black figure with pointy ears. A dog silhouette. Now Michael was a tough guy. He yelled at the thing saying, "I'm not scared of you, you Skinwalker," and tossed a few rocks he had in his pocket. One hit the pipe, and the other fell into the brush below. That shadow silhouette dog stood up, on 2 legs like a person. We all freaked out, jaws dropped. Then Cordy said, "Look, another one to the left." Tommy said, "There's another on the right." So 3 silhouettes of pointy dog-eared people on the hill. I had told them to go back up, so we could get back to the car. The things to the right and left of the hill started to move down towards us. Now there's just one standing guard on that hill, the one who stood up first. Now we're trying to go back, but we're still 3/4 of the way, and under us is complete darkness. It was quiet for a few minutes. Then we heard a girl crying. Sounded like she was hurt and scared, almost in pain. We were overcome with a strange feeling of wanting to help. Michael wanted to go back towards the end and crawled down and helped this girl. I almost followed too, but inside I was like, no, this is wrong. Something isn't right. So I yelled at him and everyone, saying, "You are stupid. Look at that thing up there on the hill. Did you not see those things? It's a trap. Screw that fake crying. If that girl is hurt, we'll come back when the sun's up in 2 hours and check. 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. is sunrise." Now the moment I said this, the crying stopped. All the guys freaked out, saying they can't believe what overcame them. They said they'd almost forgotten what they saw before. Halfway on the pipe now, and we hear a native drum being played like a powwow. We start running on this pipe, a third of the way almost to the car, and then Corey stops us. We can all hear it under our feet, a sound like a pack of snarling, growling, and yelping coyotes, but it's pitch dark below. But we know they are under us. We run at full speed. We made it back to the car and got out of there as fast as possible to a well-lit gas station and explained what happened to Thurl. We couldn't get the girls crying out of our heads, and we went back in daylight just to make sure. We did not find a girl. Instead, in the area we heard the crying we saw a coyote watching us far in the distance. It was not shy, just looked at us for 4 seconds and walked into the brush. I did not want to go back there again after that. This is 100% true, so this will probably be a boring account compared to some other post here, but I wanted to share this memory somewhere and maybe get opinions on the matter. I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. My mom would often take us camping in the summers. This particular camping trip was somewhere in the vicinity of Shiprock, New Mexico. My mother took my older brother Chris, who was 10 at the time, and myself, who was 8, camping often in those days, and preferred dispersed camping on BLM and PS land to camping in managed grounds. So she'd usually find us a spot and make herself busy by setting up the tents and pit while Chris and I would scamper around and explore the area. On this particular trip, we arrived in the middle of the day, and as my mom started setting up camp, Chris and I started to explore the area around our campsite. We wandered into the woods around our campsite. Being in the desert, it was really just stunted trees and sagebrush, so I hesitate to describe it as a forest. But the trees and brush were taller than me and provided a decent screen. I wandered down into a gully and came face to face with what I would later describe to my mother as a wolf kangaroo. It was crouched low, with long, slender arms reaching down onto the ground, and large, pointed ears like a deer. The fur covering its body was sandy brown and patchy, as if it had mange. It had large orange gold eyes, and a snout like a wolf or a coyote. It bared its teeth at me and stood up. At its full height, it was the biggest animal I had ever seen, towering over us and the sagebrush. I had never been, and probably still have never been, as frightened as I was then. Chris and I started screaming for Mom to come to our rescue. Chris regained his senses before me. He took off running back up to the embankment to the campsite. The wolf kangaroo turned and speed skated away from us, through the brush and scree. Its legs were backwards, like a dog's, and its strides took it far away and fast, faster than any deer or antelope I've ever seen. After a split second of staring at it in complete horror, I followed my older brother up to the embankment, screaming bloody murder for my mom. We were so frightened that Mom packed us back into the car and moved camps, conceding for once to stay in a managed campground. Chris and I were too scared to sleep in our own tent that night, and clung to our mom. At the slightest sound of a twig snapping in the brush, we would be petrified. So that's my story. It's boring compared to some of the other ones on here, but it's 100% true, and I wanted to share. I vividly remember the way this animal moved as it glided away from us into the desert, and the sheer and utter horror I felt looking into its face. Chris and I have never managed to find an explanation for what we saw that day in the brush. Skinwalkers or Yenaldushi are just a few stories that kept me up at night, with the covers over my head. Here's a quick one for you guys. A Navajo tribal police officer was driving west on what used to be officially named Highway 666. It was lightly snowing, maybe 1/4 of an inch, which is a lot of snow for home, and he sees an old woman walking on the side of the road. How she got there and where she was going was not apparent, because she was far too out in the middle of nowhere. He didn't see her right away, but as he passes, he noticed that she is dressed in traditional clothing, a shawl, dress, moccasins, and her hair was in a traditional bun. Not too odd, many elders still chose to dress traditionally, but why was she out in such cold weather this late at night? Hitchhiking maybe? He passed her too quickly, and now has to turn around. And as he makes a U-turn, he notices that she is nowhere to be seen. This is fairly flat terrain, and he for sure saw an old woman walking down the road. He pulls the squad car over, and steps out with his flashlight. Confused, he manages to find a woman's footprints in the shallow snow. He follows the footprints, until they suddenly turn into what look like dog footprints, leading away from the road in a hurry. He immediately jumps back into the squad car and meets up with another officer near his patrol. He's a little shaken up, but asks the other officer if he has ever seen anything like that. The officer tells him that he has. He also explains that sometimes it's an old woman, sometimes it's a very beautiful young girl, but always on that road and always in the snow, waiting for the right Good Samaritan to let her into their car. I still get nervous driving down those wide open spaces at night. I keep my eyes strictly on the road and turn my music up high. Also, I rarely pick up hitchhikers, and never at night.